My wife took a break to tour Europe with her college friends, so I divorced her. That's the short version. The version people hear and immediately ask the same question. Wasn't that an overreaction? So, let me give you the longer one, because the trip was never really the point. The point was the boarding pass I found in our filing cabinet, dated 6 weeks before she ever mentioned Europe to me. The point was $4,800 moved out of our joint account in careful, unremarkable installments. She expected to come home to the same house, the same husband, the same arrangement we'd had for 6 years. Instead, she got a certified mail notification from a law firm somewhere between Lisbon and Barcelona. I'd already called a lawyer. I'd already signed the paperwork. The boarding pass is what made me do it. I found it on a Saturday. She'd left for brunch around 10, her travel folder sitting on the kitchen counter, where she always dropped things she meant to bring with her and forgot. Pale blue folder, the kind with the elastic band. I noticed it when I was going through the mail. I wasn't snooping. I was looking for the car registration because I'd been meaning to handle a parking permit situation for 2 weeks and kept not doing it. The registration wasn't in the folder. What was in the folder was a printed boarding pass, Lisbon Portela Airport as the destination, and a date that was 6 weeks earlier than the morning she sat me down and announced, not asked, announced, that she needed to do this trip. I stood at the counter for a long time after that. I put the boarding pass back exactly where I found it and made another cup of coffee that I didn't drink. Sarah had told me about the trip on a Wednesday night. I'd come home from work. I coordinate curriculum for a school district. So by the end of a Wednesday in October, I'm running on caffeine and a deep, quiet resentment of standardized testing. And she was at the dining table with her laptop open, which usually meant she was working late, which usually meant I should start dinner. I started dinner. She came in while I was chopping onions and said, without any particular build-up, "I've decided I need to do this Europe trip." I asked when she'd been thinking about it. She said she'd been thinking about it for a while. I asked how long. "A while, Brian. Why does the timeline matter?" It mattered, I thought, because we were married. But I said, "How long would you be gone?" 3 months, she said, leaving in 2 weeks. Her college friend group, she called it that, the friend group, like it had official standing, had been planning it, and she wasn't going to miss it again. She'd missed the big trip 5 years ago because of our wedding, she reminded me, as though I'd made her miss it on purpose rather than having scheduled the wedding 8 months before anyone mentioned a trip. I turned back to the onions. She stood in the kitchen doorway. I recognized the posture. She was braced for an argument, her chin slightly raised, already drafting a response to whatever I was about to say. She did this every time I had concerns about anything. She got ready to be unreasonably resisted, so she could reasonably resist my resistance. I said, "Can we talk about it before you finalize plans?" "There's nothing to finalize. I'm going, Brian. I'm not saying don't go. I'm saying, you're saying what you always say, that I don't consider you, that I make decisions without you." Her voice had that particular quality it got, smooth and slightly tired, like she'd already had this conversation in her head and found it tedious. "I knew you'd do this. I asked who was paying for it. She said she had savings. She did. She just didn't mention that some of those savings had recently been our savings. I didn't know that yet. I found the account statements 3 days later, after I'd requested paper copies of 3 months of transactions. I already had the app, so I already had access, but I wanted something I could photograph and keep. I looked at the withdrawals, $1,800 in September, $1,700 in August, $1,300 in July, and I sat with the total for a while. $4,800, moved in amounts small enough that I wouldn't notice any single one. Amounts that made sense individually if you were thinking about a home repair or a medical bill, or just a slightly expensive month. I photographed the screen, all of it. She left for brunch that Saturday after the folder incident and came back around 2 in the afternoon, apparently expecting either a fight or a concession. I gave her neither. I told her I wasn't going to argue about the trip. What I did need was to sit down together and go over the finances before she left, her timeline, her expenses, whether we needed to adjust anything while she was away for 3 months. I framed it as practical. She heard it as me accepting the situation. She agreed to the conversation. Then she changed the subject to what she'd eaten at brunch. I called my colleague Priya the following Monday from the school parking lot. Priya had mentioned a family law attorney once, casually, during a difficult stretch of her own 2 years back. I asked whether she still had the name. She said she'd text it to me right then, and then she said, in the way Priya says things, direct, no drama. Do you want me to come with you when you go? I said I'd be okay. She said, I know you'll be okay. I asked if you wanted company. I went alone. Attorney Claire Voss had an office above a dry cleaner downtown, which I found oddly reassuring. No marble lobby, no art. She was thorough and specific and didn't waste time being sympathetic. She explained the community property rules in our state. She explained the divorce petition process, the timeline for an uncontested versus contested proceeding, how certified mail service worked for someone abroad, legally valid, she said, provided it was handled correctly, and she would handle it correctly. She explained what documentation I should be gathering. I asked her how long the whole thing would take. She said, that depends on how cooperative she is. Budget for 6 months, hope for 4. I didn't file that day. I went home, made dinner, and added a new section to the running document I keep on my laptop. I use it for work tasks, errands, things I'm tracking. I titled the new section Week 1, and under it I wrote, account statements, boarding pass photo, Voss follow-up, talk to Theo. My brother Theo is a contractor. He came over the following weekend to help me reseal the bathroom grout, which had been an ongoing project of mine for approximately a year. While we were in the bathroom with the caulking gun, I told him what was happening. He didn't say much for a moment. Then he said, you want me to hold anything for you? Copies of stuff? I said I might take him up on that. He said, okay. Then, the grout in here is genuinely terrible, Brian. How long did you let this go? I told him about a year. He shook his head and got back to work. Sarah left on a Tuesday. She had 2 large suitcases and a carry-on, and she'd been moving things from our shared closet into those bags over the previous week, in a way that was, I now understand, more organized than spontaneous. She hugged me at the door. The hug was real. I want to be accurate about that. Whatever else was happening, she wasn't performing affection in that moment. I hugged her back. She seemed a little surprised that I wasn't upset, or not visibly upset, which told me she'd been prepared for a scene and wasn't sure what to do without one. She said, I'll text when I land. She did. That night, 9:30, my time. Just her name and a heart. I looked at it for a second. Then I typed a thumbs up and put the phone face down on the nightstand. I filed the divorce petition on day 17. I sat at the kitchen table with my laptop, emailed Voss the signed authorization, and then I just sat there. The house was very quiet. I'd fixed the porch boards the previous spring and they didn't creak anymore, which had seemed like an accomplishment at the time. Now the silence felt specific, like the house was waiting to see what I'd do next. I closed the laptop, went to bed at a reasonable hour, set my alarm because I had an 8:30 meeting about 7th grade social studies benchmarks, which, whatever else was happening in my life, were still happening. That night, before I fell asleep, my phone buzzed once. Instagram notification, Sarah had posted her first photo. A hilltop somewhere outside Lisbon, golden afternoon light. 47 likes already. A caption about choosing yourself. I turned the phone over, stared at the ceiling for a while. I wasn't angry exactly. I was something more like exhausted by the distance between the life she was posting about and the one I'd actually been living beside her. I turned the phone face down and went to sleep. The divorce papers reached her in Lisbon on day 19. I know because Voss's office confirmed the certified mail pickup and sent me the notification the same afternoon I was sitting in a department meeting about spring curriculum reviews. My phone buzzed in my jacket pocket and I left it there until the meeting ended, then checked it in the hallway, then went back to my desk and opened a spreadsheet about 8th grade history standards. I don't know what I expected to feel. Mostly I just felt like I needed to finish the spreadsheet. Sarah called that evening from what her Instagram story identified as a cafe in the Alfama district, based on the tile work visible behind her in the photo she'd posted 4 hours earlier. Her voice was controlled in the way voices get when someone is very carefully not screaming. There has to be a mistake, she said. There's no mistake. Brian, I'm on vacation. I know. I hope it's going well. Silence. Then, you can't be serious right now. I told her I was, and that going forward I'd prefer we communicate through our attorneys. She didn't have an attorney yet, which I knew, so this landed awkwardly. She said she wasn't getting an attorney because this wasn't real. This was Brian being Brian. This was exactly what she'd always said about me, that I punished her for wanting a life outside the marriage. I didn't argue. I said goodnight, and I meant it sincerely, and I hung up. She called 3 more times that week. Each call followed the same arc, confused, then hurt, then angry, then quietly desperate in a way that was genuinely hard to listen to. I answered the second call because I'll be honest about this, I still wanted to hear whether she was going to say something real. She didn't. She said we could talk through this when she got home, that she understood she'd handled the announcement badly, that she should have given me more notice. More notice. That was the framing. Not discussion, not mutual decision. More notice. After that call, I responded to every attempt in writing through Voss. It was the right move practically. It was also the only way I could hold the line without my own uncertainty talking me out of it. The paper bank statements arrived the second week. I already had the photographs, but I went through the originals anyway, sitting at the kitchen table with a highlighter like I was grading papers. The pattern was clear. July, August, September, $4,800 total. Each transfer from joint to her personal checking account. The amounts didn't suggest emergency spending. They suggested planning. I packaged everything and dropped it at Voss's office on a Thursday afternoon. The credit card I found by accident, which sounds implausible, but is genuinely how it happened. I was canceling a streaming subscription we'd shared, seemed pointless to keep paying for it, and the customer service representative, after pulling up the account by our address, mentioned a second account associated with the same address under my wife's name. I asked some questions. The card had been opened 18 months ago, and the statements went to her office address rather than our home. I said thank you, ended the call, and sat with that for about 10 minutes. 18 months. We'd been to her company holiday party during that 18 months. We'd repainted the living room. Her mother had visited for a week, and we'd all had dinner together 3 times. 18 months is a long time to be living 2 versions of the same life. I called Voss and described what I'd learned. She said, "Get me the statements." I contacted the card company, explained I was conducting a financial review as part of a divorce proceeding, and they directed me to the proper request process. Voss's office handled the formal part. When the statements came back, the total across 18 months was just over $11,000. Hotels, flights, experiences. The category breakdowns read like someone constructing a separate life in small increments. I want to be precise about something. I wasn't looking for evidence of another person. I wasn't interested in that story, and I'm still not. What the credit card established was a pattern of financial decision-making in which I simply did not exist. She hadn't hidden the account from a partner she was deceiving about a relationship. She'd hidden it from a husband she'd decided didn't need to be included in her financial reality. That distinction matters to me more than I expected it to. Around week 6, I got a DM from Keisha. Keisha was on the trip. She'd been tagged in the Lisbon photo and several subsequent ones. Always laughing, always at the center of the group. The message was carefully worded in the way messages are, when someone is trying to extract information while appearing to offer it. "Hey Brian, just want to make sure Danny told you about the Rome plans before she left. Don't want there to be any miscommunication." I read it twice, then I read it again. Keisha wasn't worried about miscommunication. Keisha was worried about what I knew and who I'd told. The message confirmed what the boarding pass had suggested. The friend group had known about this trip for months before Sarah told me. Keisha's DM was about managing the story in case I started talking. I wrote back once. She told me what she wanted me to know. "Thanks for reaching out." Then I screenshotted the exchange and sent it to Voss with a note explaining the context. Theo came over in week 7 to help me prep the house for listing. I'd talked to the real estate agent, a woman named Patrice who'd sold 2 other houses on our street and who knew us both the way neighbors and neighborhood professionals know people, which is to say by sight and reputation and accumulated small interactions. She walked through the house and said, genuinely, that I'd kept the place beautifully. The crown molding in the hallway, the refinished floors, the porch I'd rebuilt board by board over 2 weekends the spring before last. Theo and I repainted the guest room while Patrice finalized the listing materials. He ran a roller across the wall and said, "Both of you are going to profit from a porch you built yourself. That's how marriage works, Theo. Only when both people are building something." I didn't answer that. He wasn't wrong, but I also wasn't ready to agree with it out loud yet. The listing went live on a Thursday. The photos were good. Patrice knew her job. By Friday evening, I had a text from her saying there had been strong interest and 2 scheduled showings for the weekend. I looked at the listing on my phone, at the photo of the kitchen where Sarah had made the announcement, and the hallway I'd repainted and the porch I'd rebuilt, and I felt something complicated that I didn't fully examine. Sarah's mother called me that Saturday morning. Janet Calloway, 61, a retired school administrator from outside Cincinnati who had always been straightforwardly kind to me in a way that I'd appreciated without fully understanding. I expected her to ask me to reconsider. Instead, she said, "I'm not calling to defend her. I want you to know that." I waited. "I've watched Danny do this to people. She cares about her whole life," Janet said. "She gets close and then she needs to leave, and she always believes the person will be there when she comes back. I'm sorry it happened to you. You didn't deserve it." I asked her one question. I hadn't planned to, but it came out. Did she know? Before we got married, did she know she was going to do something like this? Janet was quiet for a moment. Then, "She didn't plan to hurt you, but she never really planned to stay in one place either. She just didn't tell you that." I thanked her. After we hung up, I stood in the kitchen for a while. The problem with that conversation was that it removed the clean narrative. It was easier in some ways when I was thinking about deliberate deception. Janet's version was sadder. Sarah hadn't built a trap. She'd built a life she preferred and assumed I'd wait in it. The email arrived end of week 7. Sarah's personal address, not through counsel. She still hadn't hired anyone. It was long, and it was, in a lot of ways, the warmest communication I'd received from her in 2 years. She wrote that she'd done a lot of thinking, that she understood now that she should have talked to me before making plans, that she missed home, that she was willing to come back early if I withdrew the filing, and that she believed we could work through this. I read it 3 times. I was looking for the place where she mentioned the account withdrawals, looking for the credit card, looking for any indication that she understood the scope of what I'd found. It wasn't there. The email was a sincere attempt to return to the life we'd had, the life where I absorbed the decisions she made without me and eventually adjusted. I forwarded it to Voss with one note. She doesn't mention the account. She doesn't mention the credit card. She wants to come home to the same arrangement. Then I replied to Sarah once, through my personal email, because Voss hadn't told me not to, and I felt I owed her this much directness. "I appreciate the email. When you're ready to have a conversation that includes the account withdrawals and the credit card, I'm willing to talk." She did not respond to that email. What she did instead was hire an attorney. The response filing came 2 weeks later. It was, according to Voss, somewhat aggressive for a case with this level of documentation. It argued that I had filed in bad faith by initiating proceedings while Sarah was traveling for personal wellness. That framing made me want to laugh, just once, in a tired way. And that I had constructively abandoned the marriage. It also sought 50% of the home equity, which she was legally entitled to, and reimbursement for career opportunities she'd lost due to relocation during the marriage. We had never relocated. She had always worked remotely. She had worked remotely when we moved into the bungalow, which was 11 minutes from where she'd been living when we met. Voss read the filing and said, "They're testing what you have. Let me show them." I was in the process of temporarily moving my personal things to a smaller space, a rental 2 neighborhoods over, practical, 3rd-floor walk-up, no particular charm, when Patrice texted me about the open house. "Your wife came by today. Told a couple looking at the kitchen that the roof has ongoing problems. It doesn't. The inspections in the disclosure documents." I corrected her on the spot. "Thought you should know." I sat on the floor of my half-packed living room with that message for a moment. She'd driven to the house. She'd walked into an open house for a property she co-owned and actively tried to damage its sale, a sale that would benefit her financially as much as it would benefit me, not to hurt me strategically, to have something she could control. I called Voss. She said, "Good. Ask Patrice to put it in writing. That's documented economic interference and it matters." I asked Patrice. She said absolutely and sent a written statement within the hour, professional and precise, with a reference to the inspection report date. I finished packing that night. The last thing I wrapped was the coffee maker, which felt grimly symbolic and also just practical. I was going to need it in the morning. I stood in the living room one last time before I turned off the lights. The floors were good. The molding was clean. The porch was solid. I turned off the lights and locked the door and put the key in my jacket pocket. In the new apartment, I opened my laptop and looked at the document. The week 1 section had grown across the weeks into something that covered most of the page. Almost everything had a line through it. At the bottom, I added, "Mediation. Bring Voss. Bring everything." The mediation conference room was on the 14th floor of a building downtown. the kind of room designed to feel neutral and managed to feel cold instead. A long table, chairs that were slightly too formal, a window with a view of a parking structure. Sarah was already seated when I walked in with Voss. I hadn't seen her in person since the Tuesday she left, with the 2 large suitcases and the carry-on she'd packed so efficiently. She looked tired. She was dressed carefully, the kind of careful that takes effort to make look effortless. She was wearing the watch I'd given her for our 4th anniversary, a simple thing, silver, understated. I noticed it and then made a deliberate decision to stop thinking about it. Whatever it meant, it wasn't information I needed. Her attorney was polished and thorough, and spent the first 20 minutes establishing a framework in which the story of our marriage was primarily a story about Sarah's personal growth, being constrained by a husband with rigid expectations. A husband who had responded to a wellness trip with disproportionate legal action designed to gain procedural leverage. He used the phrase punitive filing twice. He had a confident rhythm, and the framing was, I'll admit, coherent enough on the surface that I understood why Sarah had hired him specifically. Voss let him finish. Then she put the boarding pass photograph on the table. Not dramatically. She just set it down and slid it to the center and said, "This is a printed boarding pass for a flight to Lisbon Portela Airport. The travel date is 6 weeks prior to the date my client's wife first mentioned this trip to him. We'd like to discuss its relevance to the financial timeline." Sarah's attorney said he didn't see the relevance. Voss said, "The relevance is that the account withdrawals, $4,800 moved from the joint account across 3 months, correlate precisely with the planning period suggested by this document. These were not ordinary household expenses. They were trip preparation funded unilaterally from a shared account, while my client contributed his income under the assumption those funds were being managed for joint purposes." Sarah was very still, not pale, not shaking, just still in a way that was different from how she'd been still before. She was looking at the boarding pass. I watched her process the fact that I'd found it, that I'd kept it, that it was sitting on a table in a mediation room in a building downtown. She hadn't known. Her attorney asked for a recess. In the hallway, I stood near the window that looked out over the parking structure. Voss was on her phone. I had a text from Theo. "How's it going?" I wrote back. "Okay, I think." He replied immediately. "Good. I've got the good coffee ready when you're done." I almost smiled. I was standing there looking at the parking structure and thinking about the fact that Theo had shown up every single time I needed him, without once making me feel like a burden, which is rarer than people acknowledge. Sarah came out of the conference room. Her attorney was at the far end of the hallway, still on his phone. She walked toward me and stopped a few feet away, and we looked at each other for a moment, the way people do when they've said most of what there is to say and what's left doesn't have clean language. She said quietly, "I didn't think you'd actually do it." "I know. I want you to know I wasn't. The trip wasn't about hurting you." I looked at her. The honest answer was that I believed her, and that believing her didn't change anything, and that those 2 things were harder to hold simultaneously than anger would have been. Anger would have been simpler. Anger had a clear direction. I said, "I know that too. That's the part that's hardest to explain to people." She looked at the window for a moment, then back at me. "So, there's really no version of this where—" "No," I said, "there isn't." She nodded once. She went back into the conference room. I stayed at the window for another minute, and then I followed. When the mediation resumed, Voss presented the credit card statements. 18 months of charges, account routed to Sarah's office address. Total just over $11,000. The mediator reviewed them without visible reaction, which is what mediators are trained to do. Voss explained the significance not as proof of infidelity. She was explicit about that, and I was grateful for the precision, but as documentation of a systematic pattern of financial separation conducted without the knowledge or consent of her client during an active marriage. Sarah's attorney asked for another brief recess. When they returned, the constructive abandonment claim was gone. The career opportunity reimbursement claim was gone. What remained was the straightforward division of assets, 50% of the home equity each, which was what I'd expected from the beginning and had no interest in contesting. The joint account withdrawals were agreed, after some back and forth, to be deducted proportionally from Sarah's equity share, not as a penalty, as an accounting of what had already moved. Voss also submitted Patrice's written statement regarding the open house incident before we got to the asset discussion. Sarah's attorney had apparently received a preview copy and had advised her, wisely, not to pursue the argument, that it had been a genuine expression of concern about the roof. The inspection report date made that position untenable. The statement sat in the record without much discussion, but its presence changed the room in a small but specific way. It established that Sarah had been willing to damage a shared financial asset for control, and her attorney knew that I knew that. And the aggressive posture that had characterized their filing quietly deflated. The mediated agreement was signed that afternoon. I shook the mediator's hand. I nodded at Sarah's attorney. Sarah and I were briefly in the elevator together. Her attorney had stopped to take a call, and neither of us said anything. The elevator was mirrored, and I looked at our reflections for a second. Two people who had spent 6 years building something that apparently meant different things to each of us, standing 3 feet apart, going down 14 floors. She was looking at her phone. I was looking at the floor numbers. The doors opened. We walked in different directions through the lobby. Theo had the good coffee ready, as promised. He'd also ordered Thai food, which was excessive and exactly right. We sat at his kitchen table, and he didn't ask for a detailed account of the mediation, and I didn't provide one. He asked if it was done. I said mostly the house sale had to close, the paperwork had to process, but the substantive part was finished. He nodded and served the food and put on a baseball game at low volume, and we ate. At some point he said, "You gonna be okay in that apartment?" I said it was fine. 3rd floor, good light, quiet enough. He said, "My couch is always there." I told him I knew. The house sale closed 3 weeks later. Patrice handled it with her usual efficiency. The buyers were a young couple who had walked through twice and asked good questions about the porch, which told me they were paying attention. I received the wire transfer notification on a Wednesday afternoon while I was in the middle of reviewing a curriculum proposal. I looked at the number, acknowledged it, set my phone face down, and finished reviewing the proposal. Later, I moved a portion to pay down the last of a graduate school loan I had been carrying for 11 years. The rest went to savings. I told no one about the closing except Voss and Theo. There was nothing to announce. Sarah called 3 weeks after mediation. I was in my apartment, a Tuesday evening, rain against the window, dinner half made on the counter. She asked if we could meet for coffee. She said she'd been thinking about what she could have done differently. Her voice was careful in a new way. Not controlled careful, the way it got before an argument, but genuinely uncertain, which I hadn't heard from her often. I asked, "What would we talk about?" She said, "I don't know, everything." I stood at the counter and looked at the half-chopped vegetables and thought about it honestly for a moment. 6 months ago, I would have said yes immediately. 6 months ago, I would have had the coffee and listened and hoped that this version of the conversation was the real one. I understood that impulse completely, and I also understood it wasn't coming from a useful place anymore. "I think I've been waiting a long time for that conversation," I said, "and I think now that it's available, I'm not sure it would help either of us." "So that's it?" "Yeah, I think so." She was quiet for a moment, then, "Okay." Just that, not angry, something more like resignation settling into place. I said, "I hope you're doing okay, Sarah. I mean that." She said she knew I did. We hung up. I stood at the counter and finished chopping the vegetables and cooked dinner and ate it at my kitchen table, looking at the rain on the window. I didn't feel like I'd won anything. I felt like I'd finally put something down that I'd been carrying so long I'd stopped noticing the weight. Janet's card arrived that same week, handwritten, small envelope, her return address in Cincinnati. It said, "I'm sorry she didn't do better. You deserve better." I set it on my desk. I moved it to a drawer eventually, but not right away. The freelance curriculum project I'd picked up, a neighboring district had contacted me about developing a middle school humanities framework, turned out to be more interesting than I'd expected. I started putting in extra hours on weekends, not out of distraction, but because I was genuinely engaged with the problem. A second district reached out in the second month. Priya asked me one morning at work how I was doing, in the real way, not the hallway way. I said, "Better," which is a weird thing to say out loud. She nodded. "Yeah, that tracks." I didn't unfollow Sarah on Instagram for 2 months. Not strategically, I just kept forgetting. And when I remembered, I'd think about it and then not do it. When I finally did, it was on a Sunday morning while I was waiting for coffee to brew. I unfollowed her, set my phone down, and went back to reading. Keisha's DM, which I'd thought about occasionally during the mediation process as a potential piece of evidence, turned out to be unnecessary. The boarding pass and the credit card statements were sufficient. What the DM had actually given me, in the end, was something more clarifying than useful. Keisha had reached out because she was worried about how Sarah's narrative would hold up if I started talking publicly, which meant the friend group understood, on some level, that the narrative had weaknesses, which meant Sarah had told them a version of our marriage in which my objections were the problem, and her choices were reasonable, and some part of her had understood it might not hold. I thought about that sometimes, but not often. I was unpacking the last box from the bungalow on a Saturday in January. I'd brought it over during the move and kept not opening it, setting it in the corner of the spare room and telling myself I'd get to it. Inside was the usual miscellany of a shared life: a charger I'd been looking for, a paperback I'd meant to finish, a small picture frame I decided to keep, and at the very bottom, the pale blue travel folder with the elastic band. I picked it up. I already knew what was inside. The boarding pass was where I'd left it, or where she'd left it, depending on how you wanted to count. I took it out and looked at it one last time. Lisbon. The date printed in the small font beneath the destination. The date that had explained so much while explaining nothing that could be fixed. I walked to the kitchen and fed it through the shredder I'd bought for the divorce documentation process and never gotten around to returning. The sound it made was very ordinary. A brief mechanical complaint and then silence. I put the empty folder in the recycling bin, washed my hands, poured coffee, sat down at my kitchen table and opened my laptop. The document at the top of the screen was still titled Things to Do This Week. I'd started it 6 months ago with account statements and attorney appointments and evidence to gather. The list now was short. Tuesday, dentist appointment. Friday, call Theo. Saturday, farmer's market, and pick up the good coffee he'd mentioned. I started working.